Good morning, everyone. Oh, I'm probably too tall, but I don't have a choice. I am happy to present the next talk, which is on policies in a rapid response scenario. Policies are established so you can look for a response and also convergence between the state and public interests. It is worth saying that SARS-CoV-19 in Mexico should have a robust training and a scientific outlook because public policies implemented for it are based on scientific evidence. So, based on that, I am happy to introduce Dr. Hugo López Gatell. He will be presenting some information regarding policy and considerations for rapid clinical research during pandemic responses. Dr. López Gatell is a surgeon specialized in internal medicine, a master's in medical sciences by the National University of Mexico, and also a major from Johns Hopkins. He is currently the Undersecretary of Health as of December 1st, 2018, and like I said before, he is the head medical advisor for the presidency when facing the COVID-19 pandemic. He is currently a member of the Early Alert and Epidemiological Response Team with the World Health Organization. Additionally, I would like to emphasize some things that I believe are very relevant about his professional background. Dr. Hugo López Gatell was the Deputy Director of Epidemiology with the Ministry of Health in 2008, and he also helped tackling the influenza pandemic. He was also the head of innovation and surveillance of infectious diseases in the National Institute of Public Health, and also head of national health surveys with the National Health Institute. Dr. López Gatell, you have the floor. Go ahead, please. Thank you, Dr. Eduardo Lascano. Thank you for these kind words, introductory words. In the next few minutes, I would like to share some reflections with two purposes. The first purpose is to share the perspective of a government official currently in service about the challenges that are faced during a pandemic and what the key contribution can mean that clinical research brings, and coordination mechanisms like clinical research networks, local ones, regional ones, and global ones. But the second purpose of my talk, and I have the best intentions, hopefully this will be part of a symposium for reflection on clinical research. I would like to talk about make some reflections and to share some critiques and some self-critique as to how we can work better structure and how do we build these networks. How do we work across networks and networks working with health institutions within countries or other areas, as well as other regional governing areas that are focused on health. The first is a starting point on an ethical reflection I believe is key when clinical research is done, and that is, why do we do research? What for? To answer this question, well, if we were to answer this question, it would take all of us to say we do clinical research for people, for their well being, to protect their health, to guard their lives. There is no doubt that this is the key reason driving all of us here today. But there are some other purposes which are also legitimate, but can have uh, different competitive nuances and can stray us from the main purpose. These objectives or these different dynamics can be do research so you can stay prestigious uh, or move forward professionally through different publications or move up in the academia sector, move up in hierarchy. And there may be some direct motivations trying to get a patent so you can develop a product for the health sector, but hoping to gain financially from it, either directly or indirectly, for those who are leading the research. As you can see in the next reflections, this ethical crossroads is something I underline because in all of the challenges I will make reference to, we can circle back to this question and the answer where hopefully uh, people, focusing on people is all supersedes any other motivation. From the point of view of a national state or a responsible government, a national state, and focused on public policies, our aspiration is that clinical research is done during the response and during the recovery from a health issue. And what is important for the government is that clinical research is effective in order to generate scientific knowledge that supports decisions that are quick, inclusive, and focused on society. And why is this so important? And going back to this last portion of this phrase, obviously providing evidence or evidence-based public policies, if this something often happens in countries and in regions that this social perspective is not considered when putting together a public policy. It happens in public policy and health policies that the social perspective is left last when putting together a policy or a response or the recovery. Therefore, we can identify a series of motivations and challenges when doing clinical research and when establishing clinical research networks. Let us take a look at some of them. First, there is a local, national, regional, and global need that is not necessarily the same one, or are not necessarily working together with doing clinical research. Some of the investigation avenues, like I said a while ago, can vary a lot when you have these different geographical perspectives for reflection. Your global questions that are relevant for an anonymous human being, a seasonal, or a person who does not have a context or social context, these can always be helpful. Is medication A better than medication B? Is this medication good so we can deal with this health issue? But not always will the answer be focused on discovery or the impact that you can get after you ask that specific question. That is why, together with planning, design, implementation, analysis, leading the effort, information, and translation of all this information, after you translate everything that comes out of clinical trials, then you arrive at the question, what's next? Is this something that we can implement or replicate in other contexts that are not as great after after the effectiveness is not as important, but actually how efficient your product is, whatever product was discovered. And the gap between these two concepts, efficacy that comes out of clinical research, and the effectiveness or feasibility, whether you can apply this or replicate this in a public health context, these two can be detached from each other. Also, social and cultural context can change your realities, not only access, but also circumstances and environmental, social, cultural, biological situations. And lastly, the response upon discovering these new approaches. There are also limited capabilities in several contexts. Sadly, most of the world, more than more than 7 billion people in the world, lack the right conditions so they can have access to the generation of scientific knowledge on one hand, innovation, but on the other hand, for the specific translation of that into specific solutions. And now, for the first time now, I am going back to the question I asked at the beginning of the talk. Are we motivated by trying to discover something new for people? Then if we want to do that, we have to stay mindful of this reality. A fourth motivation I would like to highlight is the discrepancy that you can see and usually do see between the medical perspective, which is individual, and the public health one, which is a group outlook. And I am trying to be respectful to my colleagues in the US. I would like to mirror ourselves with the United States versus what the rest of the country see, most of our countries, which is the evolution, not necessarily consecutive, of two communities, the medical or biomedical community and the public health community. They do not grow together. And that is why I am using the United States as a reference. Maybe public entities, NIH, for example, as far as I know, has the mandate that Dr. Clifford Lane mentioned. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, have some other mandates that are closer to application, but they're more focused on populations. The same thing can happen to Mexico. Different institutions, academic institutions, in practice that are focused on medical research versus the different institutions that are focused on public health. So these are aspects that go beyond the political or administrative concepts, and they go into different concepts and the application of policies. This should take us to working together in coordination so there is a synergy of great networks like clinical research networks with other great ones and multiple public health networks. Just a while ago, Dr. Ruiz Palacios made reference to the emergence of H1N1 influenza in 2009, and we were thinking about the discrepancies that you could have between the results that come out of very important networks like the Mexican network compared to the public health labs network led by the reference lab INDRE and the national networks. And sometimes these discrepancies, like the discrepancies on the geographical origin of the pandemic or the transfer, the interspecies transfer, can be important in order to putting together a response and recovery effort. And just a few things before I finish, the quantity, the quality, and the relevance of clinical information and its products or byproducts is very important. Sometimes the scientific community can have a great drive to produce in larger numbers, to be more productive, generate more articles, have more symposium sessions, and have more students that get trained. But quantity can threaten quality because it throws a wrench at the robust mechanisms that you have to have when you establish a methodology. But not only that, the relevance for the application uh, for things like a sanitation emergency, and especially when you're focused more on quantity instead of quality. The other one is opportunity versus originality. We all know about the different pandemics that have come up and the different situations that we've seen. And we see when you see a renowned academic figure protecting information that can be very relevant to change lives, because what they want to do is to preserve the originality of their publication or the prestige tied to that research so they can get a prize or whatever. And this is another point. And at this point, I go back to the original question in my talk. Important consequences that are practical include, but are not limited to, gaps of evidence before deciding on public policies when responding to an emergency. Inefficiency of these responses because there is duplicity of efforts, as well as inconsistencies in evidence. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the entire world has experienced a phenomenon that I believe can illustrate this, and that is political decisions of national states on vaccinations and before vaccinations, deciding on possible medical treatments and mitigation measures. There were a lot of ups and downs with this, questioning how good of a decisions these were. And in a modern world like today, where non-scientific information, including misinformation or information that is put out there to confuse people, this is actually very dangerous. Deciding on what the best vaccine was, at what age could you start vaccinating, or the use of certain medical devices. These were all reasons for this misinterpretations of information versus a set of clear information that communities were going to get. And this leads us to reflect, like I was saying a moment ago, translating knowledge to put it out to the public. Another thing is that this exacerbates inequalities, because if clinical spaces do not consider geographical, social, cultural, economic aspects, this can lead to exacerbate or widen inequalities, not only on primary healthcare services, but also understanding medical publications, but preparing public policies as well. One thing is science and how it can be discredited, as well as public policies. The credibility of everyone is at stake when the robustness of scientific methods are not appreciated by regular citizens. People who are not medical experts, they face a threat, a health threat, and they want consistency in the answers they get from the medical sector. So 7 elements for action so we can have an effective research effort upon public health emergencies. The first one, sorry, I got stuck with my slides. So the first one is consider firsthand during the preparation phase that research questions are relevant and consistent with the response plan. If there is no roadmap, or if the plan is only generic with regards to its intervention with public health and governance that has to be executed in the response. Well, the research work can have very nice, sophisticated questions, but they have to be able to build up knowledge, including the development of pharmaceutical products and devices. They may do that, but they may not be good for a response. Also, from our point of view, we have to have large clinical trials, national and international ones, that allow us to have significant statistical data as well as clinical significance and epidemiological significance that are sufficient so we can put together a response. Also, during COVID, we saw different situations with clinical trials, and there was a big fragmentation of efforts. Currently, the World Health Organization tried to put clinical trials, but they did not get enough momentum so they could build up all this knowledge. And ultimately, for communities putting together meta-analysis and systemic reviews and trying to compile evidence, but they've already lost some time, and they could have prevented that if they had done larger clinical trials. And with this, we have to consider how people, populations, and context are represented. And let me just reiterate this. It is not only having people represented in statistics. We know that we tend to assume and we tend to believe that populations are identical and distributed fairly. And this is a assumption of statistics generally, but we know that people are not independent. They're not distributed independently. Their risks and their social situations are linked one another. The next one is, if you have a discovery that will not be easy to implement, it may be nice looking with some, it may have some other purposes, commercial interests or academic interests, but it may not be feasible to implement. The second one, protocols. We've talked about a lot of communities that have done efforts such as this network, together with the great work of NIH and some other networks in Europe, in Asia as well, in Africa, and possibly some in Latin America and the Caribbean. But I believe we still have an area of opportunity there. Trying to put together methods that allow us to compare results. We would also like to anticipate the expedite implementation of these protocols with local and global research committees. You have to have specifications that will allow you to have approval, and then, but you have some of the generics that will allow you to put all this together. And also, take a look at the local versions that can give us specifics on how to implement these efforts. Clinical networks. We also believe that it is important that you regularly take a look at your purposes, your capabilities, just like Dr. Fauci said and Dr. Lane. Work prior to the pandemic or during the AIDS pandemic. They attempted to have an armamentarium and a series of capabilities that will be useful for COVID now, and it will be useful for other pandemics in the future. But there are some other research groups that are more specialized in some fields, and in the height of a pandemic, they try to go from one place to the other, and sometimes that may delay the coordinated efforts of less developed groups, but that are actually more competent in issues that are important. So we have to regularly take a look at what is the group that can best add value during a pandemic, and not only use your collaboration history that you know of. And then preparedness for grouping data, analyzing data. obviously exchanging information. This all needs preparation, the different scenarios where you will see these capabilities being laid out, not only through research committees, but also through other legal channels. Or like Dr. Biaz said a while ago, Dr. Svrask will talk about this topic later on. New networks, let networks evolve so they can approach local and regional challenges. The fourth point is about data and materials shared. Long-lasting relationships come from being honest to each other. There is a saying that goes like that in Mexico, and I'm sure that you have it in other places. You know, a clear set of rules before the emergency, before starting your research, before getting the funding, before the first publication. You have to have clear rules of intellectual property, copyright, preservation of the materials, data, samples. This can lead to one of the darkest aspects of humanity, which is selfishness. And then benefits only go one way. Integrated and standardized repositories for data and samples allow us to have better and cross-cutting results and conclusions. This is something important too. We've seen it with COVID-19, establishing what assets are public or private. This can all lead to patents, private patents, and then using or exploitation of those patents. In some places, especially in high-income countries, there are clear rules as to intellectual property and materials of whatever is discovered with public funding. In countries that are not as advanced, there may be some challenges in having a legal definition of as to who owns that patent or whatever discovery is found, or can it be used to benefit the public or benefit the private sector. These rules have to be clearly established. Lastly, databases, they have to be have to have interoperability, but should also be auditable, or you should be able to audit them. Otherwise, there will be confusion and information will be disjointed. And data has to be always available so they can be audited by the different communities in a peer review, but also by independent organizations led by different countries, regional and global entities. The fifth recommendation or suggestion is equality and integration, and this, for the third time, goes back to the first reflection I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, but also underlining social justice when it comes to medical research. We have to represent all population groups and all its determinants, because otherwise your statistical, epidemiological, or clinical information will not interpret specific or actual realities. We will be putting together a calculation for an aseasonal human being and not based on geographical specifics. Research priorities are also important. They have to have a social outlook or a social point of view, not only locally, but globally. Take a look at the global south. This may not sit well with all of us, this critical call to action, but we have to do it. During the during the COVID-19 and influenza pandemic, we saw a very unfortunate practice of focusing resources on some specific regions of the world, the global north, and leave the global south without, or send them to the back of the line. And we are all here from the scientific community, the health community. We know that this does not work. We are only protected as long as we are all protected. And we saw this once again. We have to definitely think about that. Horizontal collaborations could definitely add important value. That is why I celebrate and I am happy that we have our colleagues from 2 African countries where they have collaboration networks. And hello to people from other networks in the world. Translation of results. This has to come together with access to products and services after that a medical discovery can lead to. Sixth, we believe that we have to investigate from and for the community. That is why I go back to the ethical call to action I mentioned at the beginning. Information can be relevant locally and regionally. Planning has to be in participation with the population, because if there is more participation, there is more likelihood in getting relevant questions, cultural and socially appropriate methods, but you have more transparency and there is better accountability. And we have to answer to the population. We have to explore real phenomenon, clinical and epidemiological, and on the operational side, we cannot use a discovery that is applicable in a high technological capacity hospital, high income country hospital, when we actually want to overcome a public health situation in a context where is a lot less. The motivations to participate for participating in research efforts has to be ethically appropriate, but also socially friendly. People enroll in clinical trials because they expect to overcome a threat that they and their family members are facing, or their communities. We have to be careful with this because social vulnerability, cultural vulnerability can always be present. And beyond formalities within research committees, we have to be sensitive to the fact that there is a local context. Operations have to be care centered. Obviously, urgent care centers or large public health care centers are very good, so we can get good information, but people have a specific reality that they go through. The more we can put together cross-cutting or longitudinal studies or clinical trials that consider the reality where people actually live, the better adoption we will get from the population. And we have to also remember that we have to deliver. People do not read the New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet or Science or Cell or other magazines. People who suffer these threats, these public health threats, are usually comprised by non-technical, non-scientific communities. And it is a moral and ethical obligation of all researchers to come back and say, this is what we're doing, and this is an appropriate cultural information. This is thanks to the valuable work that you, Mr. Citizen, allowed me to do with your contribution, with your tax dollars. The last is effective governance. We have to take a look at and review whether what we are doing is appropriate, or have conditions changed? Do we need to change them? Attempting to have an effective governance so we can put together an agreed agenda with social stakeholders, with governments, with the academia that has to be represented at all levels of governance. In that sense, leadership has to be structured. Just like Dr. Lane said it a while ago, there are some portions of leadership that do not need to operate all the time, but are actually key that they participate, because in other elements like strategic and tactical planning, or with leadership that you can use to resolve an issue or discrepancies, this is all very important. We also have to remember that as part of this governance, the democratic vision and its actual spirit, I'm not talking about other things, but actually the control points or the trade-offs have to be very important. No one should have all control of governance when you have something as complex as a clinical research networks, and decisions cannot be made arbitrarily. This is very important when we talk about research subjects, like we've seen it before with longitudinal studies for infectious diseases and not infectious diseases. And lastly, transparency and accountability, which is linked to what I said a while ago regarding delivering results. This is important at all times. Be open and ready for the public eye and scrutiny. This means different offices at all levels of government, the legislative branch, executive branch, hopefully never Supreme Court or the judicial branch, but we have to be open and ready for public scrutiny. And we owe ourselves to our people, to taxpayers. Thank you.